Welcome to Mr. Night Media.
It was a moonless, starless night when Karim, a seasoned taxi driver, was finishing his last shift. The roads were eerily quiet, the city long behind him as he drove along a desolate stretch of highway. The silence was almost comforting after hours of city noise, just the hum of his car engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees that lined the road. As the minutes dragged on, Karim found himself alone on the empty road, the headlights of his cab cutting through the thick, dark night. It was the kind of darkness that made the world outside feel distant, like he was driving through a dream. He was nearing a particularly desolate stretch, an area known for being isolated, miles from the nearest town. He had driven this road many times before, but tonight, something felt different. The air was thick with an unshakable sense of unease. Just as he rounded a bend, something caught his eye, a figure, standing on the shoulder of the road, barely visible in the darkness. It was a woman, standing completely still, her face turned toward the approaching car. She wore a pale, flowing dress that fluttered faintly in the breeze, and her long hair fell over her shoulders, obscuring her face. Karim slowed down instinctively, thinking she might need help. It wasn't unusual for stranded travelers to be on the road this late at night, and he had picked up more than his fair share of late-night hitchhikers. But as he drew closer, something felt off. The woman didn't move, didn't signal for help, or even acknowledge his car. She just stood there, unnervingly still, staring straight ahead. Karim squinted through the windshield, trying to get a better look. But in the blink of an eye, the figure vanished. One moment she was there, and the next, the shoulder of the road was empty. He slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes scanned the area, expecting to see her running off into the woods, but there was no one. Just the endless stretch of road ahead and the dense trees to the side. Confused and rattled, he slowly pressed the gas and continued driving. Maybe it was a trick of the light, he thought, or his tired mind playing games with him. But no matter how hard he tried to dismiss it, the image of the woman lingered in his mind. Her motionless figure burned into his memory. About 10 minutes later, as Karim approached another curve in the road, his breath caught in his throat. The woman was back. This time she was standing directly in the middle of the road, her dress illuminated by his headlights. Her face was hidden in shadow, but her posture was the same, still, silent, unnervingly calm. She stood in his path as if daring him to drive straight through her. Karim's foot slammed on the brake, his tires screeching as he swerved violently to avoid hitting her. The car skidded to a halt on the side of the road, the sudden silence pressing down on him as his heart hammered in his chest. He sat there, gripping the steering wheel, gasping for breath, the cold night air creeping in through the window. But when he looked up, the road was empty once again. The woman had vanished, just as she had before. Shaken, Karim pulled off to the side of the road to collect himself. He couldn't explain what had just happened. Was someone playing a prank on him? Was he hallucinating from exhaustion? He checked his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman standing behind his car, but there was nothing. Determined to get out of there, Karim sped away, his nerves on edge. He didn't slow down until he reached the safety of the city's outskirts. The following day, still disturbed by what he had seen, Karim mentioned the encounter to a few other taxi drivers while waiting for his next shift to start. Their reactions surprised him. Several of them exchanged knowing looks. "You saw her, didn't you?" one of the older drivers asked, his voice low. "Who?" Karim asked, his skin prickling with unease. "The woman on the road," the man replied. A few years ago, a young woman was killed on that stretch, hit by a driver who never stopped. Ever since, people have reported seeing her ghost late at night, standing in the middle of the road or by the shoulder. They say she's looking for the person who hit her or trying to warn drivers of the danger. Karim felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had heard stories of haunted roads before, but he had never believed them. Yet after last night, he couldn't shake the image of the woman, the way she had vanished, the unsettling stillness of her presence. Does she ever do anything else?" Karim asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The older driver shook his head. "She's just there, watching, waiting. Sometimes drivers see her in the distance, and sometimes she's standing right in front of them. Karim didn't sleep well for weeks after that night, and he avoided that stretch of road as much as possible. But every now and then, when his shift took him close to that desolate highway, he couldn't help but glance at the road, half expecting to see her there, standing in the shadows, waiting for another driver to pass. And each time his hands gripped the wheel just a little tighter, afraid that one night she might step out in front of him again. Megan had babysat for the Johnsons several times before, so she was familiar with their house and their two young children, Lily and Noah. It was a quiet suburban home, tucked away in a safe neighborhood where nothing much ever happened. The Johnsons were always clear about the rules. No visitors, no late-night TV for the kids, and the children had to be in bed by 9 p.m. It was a typical Saturday night when the Johnsons asked her to babysit again. They were going out for a late dinner and would be back around midnight. Megan agreed, knowing it would be an easy night. She loved the kids, and once they were asleep, she could just hang out on the couch, watching TV or texting her friends. The evening started off uneventfully. She put Lily and Noah to bed at 9 p.m., read them a bedtime story, and tucked them in. The house was peaceful, quiet except for the occasional creak of the old floors as she moved around. Once the kids were settled, Megan went back downstairs, sinking into the plush living room couch, her phone in hand, mindlessly scrolling through social media. At around 10:30 p.m., the house phone rang. Startled, she glanced at the cordless handset sitting on the coffee table. The Johnsons hadn't mentioned expecting any calls, but she figured it might be them checking in. She picked it up. "Hello." There was no response, just silence followed by faint static and then click. The line went dead. Megan frowned, but dismissed it as a wrong number. She put the phone back on the table and resumed her scrolling. Minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, she hesitated before answering. "Hello?" she said again, her voice firmer. The same silence. Then, a faint sound, breathing, slow and deliberate. Megan's heart began to race. She hung up quickly, her palms sweaty as she stared at the phone. It was probably just a prank, she told herself, some kid playing a joke. But the calls kept coming. Every few minutes, the phone would ring. Sometimes there was static, other times just breathing, and sometimes she thought she could hear faint whispers, too soft to make out. Megan's pulse quickened, her mind racing with fear. By 11 p.m., her nerves were shot. The phone rang again, but this time she didn't answer. She just stared at it, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She knew something wasn't right. It wasn't just a prank call, it felt sinister, like someone was watching her. Terrified, Megan decided to call the police. She dialed the local station and explained the situation, her voice shaking. They took her seriously, advising her to stay calm and promising to trace the calls. "Stay on the line with us," the dispatcher said, "and don't open the door for anyone. Officers are on their way." Megan nodded even though no one could see her. She gripped the phone tightly, her hands clammy with fear. Every creak of the house now felt like a threat. Every shadow seemed to move. Suddenly the phone rang again, interrupting the dispatcher's calm voice. Megan's heart lurched in her chest. "Don't answer it," the dispatcher warned. "Stay on the line with me." But the ringing persisted, each shrill tone sending a spike of dread through her. And then, just as abruptly, it stopped. The silence was suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, the dispatcher came back on the line. Her voice was tense, more urgent now. "Megan, listen to me carefully," she said. "We've traced the calls. They're coming from a second phone line, inside the house." Megan's blood ran cold. She felt her legs go weak, her entire body frozen in place. Her mind raced. Inside the house, that was impossible. The dispatcher's voice was firm, snapping her out of her daze. "You need to get the kids and leave right now. The police are on their way." Megan's instincts kicked in. She sprinted up the stairs, her heart pounding as she threw open the kids' bedroom door. Lily and Noah were fast asleep, unaware of the danger lurking in the house. She scooped Noah into her arms, shaking Lily awake. "Shh, we need to go," she whispered, trying to keep her voice calm despite the terror clawing at her. Lily blinked, confused, but followed Megan without question. Just as they reached the top of the stairs, there was a loud creak from the attic, directly above them. Megan's blood turned to ice. The realization hit her like a punch. Someone had been in the house with her the entire time. Clutching the children, Megan rushed down the stairs, her mind racing with fear. She bolted out the front door just as the flashing lights of the police car appeared at the end of the street. The officers rushed in, guns drawn, while Megan huddled with the kids on the lawn, her body trembling uncontrollably. Minutes later, one of the officers emerged from the house, his face pale. They had found an intruder hiding in the attic, crouched near a second phone line. He had been watching Megan from the crawl space, calling her from inside the house, waiting for the right moment to strike. The man was arrested, and Megan learned later that he had broken into the house hours before the Johnsons had left, hiding in the attic until he could make his move. He had a history of violent crimes and was likely planning to harm her and the children. Megan never babysat again after that night. She couldn't shake the memory of the phone calls, the eerie silence, the heavy breathing from inside the house, and she never forgot the horrifying realization that she had been watched the entire time. It was a little past midnight when David's phone buzzed on his bedside table, waking him from a restless sleep. Groaning, he reached over to silence it, thinking it was a telemarketer or a wrong number. But when he saw the screen, the call had already ended, leaving behind a single voicemail from an unknown number. Annoyed, David considered ignoring it until morning, but curiosity got the better of him. He pressed play, expecting a mundane message or perhaps a garbled pocket dial. What he heard instead sent a chill down his spine. It was a woman's voice, shaky and desperate, pleading through sobs. "Please, please help me. He's coming. Oh God, please, someone help." Then there was a piercing scream, loud and raw, followed by what sounded like frantic footsteps and heavy breathing, and then silence. David sat up in bed, his heart racing as the eerie quiet filled his bedroom. He replayed the voicemail again, trying to make sense of it. The voice was unfamiliar, and there was no name, no location, just pure terror. He called the number back immediately, his fingers trembling as he dialed. The line was dead. Thinking it might be some cruel prank, he tried not to dwell on it. But the woman's voice haunted him, the desperation in her screams ringing in his ears long after the call ended. He could barely sleep, his mind churning with unanswered questions. Who was she? Where was she calling from? And why him? The next night, around the same time, his phone buzzed again. This time, David felt a knot of fear in his stomach before he even picked it up. Once again, it was an unknown number, and once again, there was a voicemail. He hesitated before pressing play, already dreading what he would hear. This time, there were no words, just the sound of someone running. Fast, panicked footsteps pounding against a hard surface, accompanied by short, frantic breaths. The fear was palpable, as if the caller was fleeing from something, or someone. Then, suddenly, the footsteps stopped, followed by a deafening silence. The voicemail ended abruptly. David stared at his phone in disbelief. This wasn't a prank. Whoever was calling him was in real danger, and he had no way of reaching them. He immediately reported the voicemails to the police, hoping they could trace the number and help the woman, whoever she was. The officers took down his information but seemed skeptical, chalking it up to a possible misdial or an elaborate hoax. They promised to look into it but warned him not to expect much. Frustrated and anxious, David returned home, feeling powerless. That night, the phone rang again. This time he didn't answer. His hands shook as he let it go to voicemail, the unease growing heavier with every second that passed. When the voicemail notification popped up, he stared at it for a long moment before finally pressing play. The woman's voice returned, more desperate than ever. "Please, he's here. I can't get away. He's coming back. I can't breathe. Help me." The message ended with more screams, fading into a muffled static. David was frantic now. He called the police again, demanding that they trace the number. The officers assured him they were working on it, though they still seemed doubtful that it was anything more than a sick joke. Another voicemail came the following night. This time it was just static, an eerie, broken silence that felt more menacing than the screams. David was starting to lose sleep, his thoughts consumed by the voicemails, by the mystery of the woman's cries for help. A few days later, he received a call from the police. "Mr. Callahan," the officer said in a low, measured tone, "we've traced the number that's been calling you." David's heart pounded in his chest. "And," the officer hesitated, "the number you've been receiving calls from, it's been disconnected for over 5 years." David blinked in confusion. "That's impossible. I've been getting calls from it every night." The officer's voice grew even more serious. "The number belonged to a woman named Lisa Harrington. She went missing 6 years ago. She's presumed dead. Her case was never solved." David's blood ran cold. The woman in the voicemails, the one screaming for help, the one running, the one begging for someone to save her, was a missing person, someone who had vanished without a trace. And somehow, even though her phone had been dead for years, she was calling him, her cries for help echoing from the past. He asked the officer if there was any explanation, but there was none. The case remained open, Lisa's disappearance still unsolved. That night, David sat in his darkened apartment, his phone silent for the first time in days. But even in the stillness, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, somehow Lisa was still out there, trapped, desperate, and screaming for help, her voice lost in the void between life and death. Living in a small dorm room, Jenna was a typical college student, living in a small dorm room with her roommate, Emily. They had shared the cramped space for months, and while the campus dorm wasn't particularly luxurious, it was comfortable enough. On a Friday night, Emily had gone home to visit her family for the weekend, leaving Jenna alone for the first time. Jenna didn't mind. She had planned to use the quiet to catch up on some much-needed sleep after a grueling week of exams. After watching some Netflix, she turned off the lights and settled into her bed. The dorm was eerily quiet, without the usual noise of students walking down the hall or Emily's late-night phone calls. It was around 2 a.m. when Jenna was jolted awake by a soft, rhythmic knocking on her door. Knock, knock, knock. At first, she thought she had dreamt it, her mind still groggy from sleep. She lay still, listening to the silence that followed. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. She sat up, blinking at the door. The knocks were soft, but deliberate. She glanced at her phone, 2:12 a.m. Maybe it was someone from her floor who had gotten locked out or needed help, but at this hour, deciding it was nothing urgent, she ignored the sound and turned over, pulling her blanket tightly around her. The knocking stopped for a few minutes, and just as she began to drift off, it started again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was persistent. Jenna frowned, annoyed more than afraid. Thinking it might be one of her friends playing a prank, she groggily sat up in bed, her irritation growing with each knock. But when she opened the door, she found the hallway empty. No footsteps, no whispers, no sounds of people hiding around the corner, just silence. She hesitated, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. The stillness of the empty hall felt wrong, almost oppressive. She quickly shut the door, locking it this time, and returned to bed, telling herself it was just some late-night prank. But the knocking continued. Knock, knock, knock. Her heart began to race, the rhythm of the knocks matching the pounding in her chest. She tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Whoever it was, they weren't going away. Jenna pushed her dresser against the door, hoping the added barrier would offer some peace of mind. Still, the knocking persisted every few minutes, soft but relentless. By now, it was well past 3 a.m., and Jenna was wide awake, her anxiety spiking with every new series of knocks. She texted Emily, hoping she might have some explanation, but there was no response. She texted her other friends, but none of them were on campus that night. Her pulse quickened as she realized she was completely alone. Knock, knock, knock. Terrified, Jenna grabbed her phone and dialed campus security. A guard answered, his voice gruff with sleep as she explained the situation. He promised to come by and check on things, telling her to stay inside and lock the door until he arrived. 20 minutes passed. The knocking came and went in steady waves, but no one ever responded when she called out. When the security guard finally arrived and knocked, Jenna cautiously opened the door, her heart in her throat. The guard stepped inside, shining his flashlight around the room and checking the hall. He didn't find anything out of place, no signs of anyone lingering near the door. Frustrated and a little embarrassed, Jenna thanked him and watched him leave. But as soon as he left, the knocking resumed. Knock, knock, knock. Jenna didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She sat in bed, clutching her phone and staring at the door, listening as the knocks grew softer, slower, almost as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was growing tired too. At dawn, the knocking finally stopped. The next day, Jenna was exhausted, but relieved that the strange events were over. Later that afternoon, she met with one of her friends who lived on the same floor. She told her about the knocking, expecting her friend to laugh it off as a prank or a weird coincidence. Instead, her friend's face went pale. "You didn't hear?" her friend asked, her voice a whisper. "A girl who lived in that room last year, she had a stalker. He used to knock on her door at night, trying to lure her out. One night, she opened the door and he attacked her. She dropped out after that." Chills ran down Jenna's spine. She couldn't shake the thought that whoever, or whatever, had been knocking at her door had been trying to do the same to her.